As for today's webinar, Indicators for At-Risk Native American Children. My name is Christina Nguyen, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handout pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in your room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to take a brief survey about today's presentation. You will be able to access the link to the evaluation on the last slide of the PowerPoint. We appreciate your feedback regarding this webinar. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also check out past webinars. Again, thank you for joining today's webinar. I will now turn it over to Melissa Hansen from Fox Valley Technical College to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Christina, for that introduction. As Christina mentioned, my name is Melissa Hansen, and I am a project specialist and the Region 2 liaison with the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. The Amber Alert TTA program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar as part of our Amber Alert in Indian Country webinar series. This series works to increase collaboration between state, local, and tribal communities in response to the exploitation of children to develop appropriate agency responses and to effectively address the needs of victims. Today, I will serve as your moderator for the webinar with our presenter and subject matter expert, Melissa Riley. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to submit your questions via the chat box located on your screen, and we will answer these at the conclusion of today's webinar during our Q&A portion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce and turn today's presentation, Indicators for At-Risk Native American Children, over to Melissa Riley, owner of Native Community Development Associates. Melissa?
All right. Well, thank you, Melissa, for that introduction, and to OJJDP for hosting us today. And good afternoon again. My name is Melissa Riley, and I am the owner principal of Native Community Development Associates, located here at Laguna Pueblo, about 50 miles west of Albuquerque. I am a member of the Mescalero Apache tribe, and I have been doing social work and behavioral health counseling in Indian country for almost 20 years now. So very happy to be here. Just a little bit of background again. I'm also an instructor and adjunct faculty member with New Mexico State University, which is where I earned my doctorate degree as well. So I'm very happy to be here. And I know we have a lot of people, I see some of the chat going on here, so we have a pretty diverse crowd. Very open to any questions that you might have at the end, and I hope that you gain some information from this webinar, at least some refresher information. So without any more on that, our introduction today, basically I would like for you all to at least get some more information about how I, in my professional practice, working as a consultant with several tribal courts here in and around New Mexico, have been able to use the at-risk indicators in my day-to-day work, and how I've been able to use that in my communication, not just with community, but with family, law enforcement, social workers, and tribal governments, and also our nonprofits and urban organization. So I hope that with the information provided today, you'll get some information about how you might be able to use these indicators in your day-to-day work, or at least provide you a better understanding of how these interact with your current day-to-day functions in serving children. So we have our learning objectives. We're going to help in introducing some indicators for at-risk children, particularly with Native American children, and also explore some methods with you for incorporating indicators into your standard child abuse and safety responses. So the next couple of slides, and we'll start with this one, I just wanted to provide a visual overview of whenever we talk about Indian country. You know, we talk a lot about a lot of places across the map. I mean, it's just not a central location for each or most of our states. You know, we're pretty spread out throughout the entire country. And with that, you know, we're involved with a lot of systems, state systems, federal systems, nonprofit organizations. And I think with that being said, there's an urgency to really get working together so that we can better understand how to identify and address the indicators that our Native American children are faced with. Also, you know, with our term Indian country, we also include our Alaska Native brothers and sisters who are in there's several communities out there in Alaska. So oftentimes when we say Indian country, we fail to formally acknowledge also our Alaska Native communities. So it's pretty rich in its diversity. So defining at-risk, and the reason why I start off with this slide is I think that sometimes my colleagues and I have a different understanding of how we identify or describe at-risk and how we relate that in our day-to-day work. But I found this definition that I've used for several years, and I found it to be most helpful in that at-risk is a set of presumed cause and effect dynamics that place an individual in danger of negative effects or negative events. So negative future events are things like graduation, you know, educational attainment, being a teen parent, you know, whether they're going to be involved in the justice system, they're going to be displaced, whether they're going to have health or social issues, premature death, and a whole other, not just individual, but also social and physical issues. So the term reflects a chance or probability. So some of the critics that we've had plentiful discussions on the term at risk, not just within our educational institutions, but also within our local practitioners, is that the term at risk is oftentimes seen by some as being a label that is stigmatizing. You know, if you're termed or identified as an at-risk child or an at-risk family member, that holds a certain stigma for that person or individual or within the community. Some also believe that at-risk should be focused on family and community, and children are only the bystanders or the result of their environment. And some actually believe that indicators are useless and that we can't identify a whole series of indicators at different levels and say that they apply to the child or children between the ages of 0 and 17 or 18. And, you know, I tend to agree just a little bit with some of that, but not totally, because we really need to look at indicators and the term at risk as a starting point for why we exist as social workers or providers. So, you know, I think overall we need to understand the term and at risk in order for us to be more informed and motivated to move forward in our practice. Because if we don't do that, then we're kind of looking for ways to maybe recruit clients, and that's not always a good thing. So I just wanted to share that with you. Indicators themselves are just ways to measure something. An indicator is really just a long way of saying how much or how many or to what extent or what size. Indicators are ways to just do or perform an overall measurement of something. And we measure things all the time, so this isn't in any different circumstance. So just briefly, demographics that, of course, I pulled through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Census Bureau is that we do have 566 tribes and counting. It seems like our numbers are changing every 5 to 10 years. We do have 324 federally recognized reservations, and 14 states have a Native American Alaska Native population that is beyond 100,000 people. And our national child abuse reporting stats, we have 3.6 million referrals made to child protective custody each year, according to the CDC. And annual referrals involve 6.6 million children. Of course, these are the referrals involve, in some cases, more than one child, so that's why you have that increase there. But I think it's really important that, when we're talking about national child abuse reporting stats, and we look at the high numbers of referrals and cases involving children, we really need to be thoughtful that there's another layer of diversity in the population that we're talking about, from white children, black children, Native American children, and on down the line. So the whole population that we're looking at right now is astonishing. However, when you compare that to the number of Native Americans throughout the United States, we're just a small fraction of that. But still, yet the problem is quite significant of child abuse. So in 2014, according to the CDC, there were 700,000 cases of confirmed child abuse. And I'm going to stop right here and just mention here, and I'm sure that those folks that work with Indian country or that are tribal representatives would agree, is that our data caution there is a data caution within national and state reports. Tribal data filtered through the BIA or other reporting agencies often reflect criminal civil definitions that differ from tribal codes. Some tribal codes have specific child abuse definitions, while others may not. This type of discrepancy causes some data to be unreliable. And overall what I mean by that is that although we do have these alarming numbers that we see in regards to child abuse reports, the number of confirmed cases and so forth, we at the tribal level need to remember that the data is brought forth, but we do have different definitions. If you're a tribe that has your own child protection code, or you have your own criminal code or your civil code or your family code, the definitions oftentimes do not align with what state or federal agencies have defined as child abuse or child sexual abuse or neglect and so on. So when we get to the level of substantiating a case and adjudicating those cases, whether they stay within tribal court or beyond, we need to remember that oftentimes the cases by definition are or can be different. Obviously, if the cases are of significant contain a significant event that it requires federal intervention through the BIA or FBI. For those of us in non-PL 280 states, you know, they're going to go by the standard definitions that are pretty well known throughout the country. So just wanted to make mention of that in regards to numbers, data, and definition. So ideally, starting with this graph right here, we have an event that occurs, and this is what really brings us all together as community collaborators or multidisciplinary teams or CPTs, is that an event occurs, and then we have this continuum that occurs. A child abuse case is reported, a screening takes place, and we have options to keep that report and follow up with it. Then we develop it or go through our intake process. An investigation is conducted if deemed necessary. If there's problems within the investigation process that require additional services such as forensic interviewing, then we go through there, and then for additional support services for the victim and families, we have referrals. So in presenting this continuum, I wanted to emphasize, that this is just something that continues to occur, and I think it's a standard response system that we have in place to child abuse. And, it's sometimes depending on whether how we handle the case, whether we're successful in intervention and support services, then we'll only see this continuum one time per family. If this continuum is consistently happening within one family within a 5-year period, then this just is a cycle of violence or happenings that are occurring. And at times we, as service providers, really need to think about where the gaps are. Where were we not able to provide that additional support, or where did we not ask the right question? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the upcoming slides. So I'm going to start off with that. We do have some level of at-risk indicators. We're going to talk about the categorization of the indicators themselves, but the levels of at-risk indicators I think are really important to cover first, is that we have minimal, remote, high, and imminent levels of at-risk. And the levels are important for so many reasons, because it's just like whenever we get a child abuse report, we determine whether it's a level 1, level 2, level 3 case. Oftentimes, if you're in a state agency, for example, here in New Mexico, CYFD, our state intake system has different levels that they screen the cases at. So that's one of the reasons why I think the alignment of the levels is important. So let's start with minimal. In this type, or the minimal level of an indicator in this area, basically says that, this is based on a favorable demographic, positive family, school, social interaction with limited stressors. And what I mean by favorable demographic is that when you look at not only the individual child, family, or community that you're working with, when an incident occurs, an overview of what that environment is important. If there's a high, or there's low unemployment rates that are occurring within that area of the community or within that community, we most often can look at that community as probably having assets there that are worth looking at, that can assist the family should interventions be at a minimum. Also, if there are positive family-school interactions, if there's an abundance of resources and services that are occurring within that community, and there are not a high number of family violence incidents that have been occurring or high dropout rates, then we could look at a certain situation or a community at being at a minimal level. So then our remote negative demographics, and I probably use this a little bit more in response to communities that are rural, that have more than 50 miles separation between the next urban community, or to, you know, a high-level city where we can look at nonprofit services, faith-based services as a source for support. But in these areas, the negative demographics that I refer to in this area, or if we are at the opposite of the minimal, where we have a pretty noticeable number of high unemployment, if we have, you know, a noteworthy number or percentage of folks that, or community spots that have violence. Some of the communities I work with are separated either into villages or subdivisions, and you have those subdivisions that are either what I call, or what is called here in the community as low rent, or family-owned homes or traditional homes. So within those demographics within your own community, and even within our urban cities, you know more or less where you might have those areas that you would say are that have the negative demographics, where they have a high dropout rate, where there is a high number of family violence or social problems such as gang violence and that type of thing. So looking at the indicator level from the remote perspective, that's how I would categorize that or define it. And then the high negative family interactions, this builds off of what I had just mentioned in the remote, but also has the development of personal at-risk markers. And these personal at-risk markers are things such as the type of grades that a child or students are getting. If we, for example, have state testing, you know, we have a lot of that going on right now because it's coming towards the end of the year. But if we have a high number of students that are failing or that are not coming the week of the test, or they're just not doing over well as far as graduation rates in that county or city for over a 5-year period, those are at-risk markers. Also, the types of, you know, if you're working with a family and you just say, you know what, this is a high level or a high need family, and if you look at the type of social surroundings and the people that the family or individuals are surrounded by, then you would know that, or have some inkling that this is a high-level family, a high-need family. And we'll talk a little bit more about the questions and the types of ways that we can get to the heart of getting that information from individuals and families. So the last one, imminent level, is the gateway or threshold to unfavorable risk-taking behaviors and activities. And this really gets down into the borderline areas of juvenile delinquency. We have cases, or we have families where this is occurring. We most often see experiment or fully involved in alcohol drug use that has a tendency to escalate to major drug use and volatile behaviors, to not just others but also to themselves. So here now we go in, we've just talked about the levels, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the at-risk indicators. individual. So right here I just have a diagram, and I think some of you that are familiar or that are practitioners in social work or behavioral health, you would probably be familiar with this, is that it's child-centered, family-focused type of approach to social work. So with our individual indicators, we have age, and we know that the most vulnerable population or victims in potential victims for child abuse are between the ages of 0 and 4. So individual indicators in relation to age tend to be, the level is a lot higher at times. You'll see in your work with clients whenever they're at that age, or we tend to see children within that age begin to be exposed to not just child abuse, but other forms of violence as well. Also, disability. In my own work, and then I'm just speaking from my own work experience, is that I probably had a higher number of disabled children that were victims or alleged victims of child abuse as compared to their counterparts with no disabilities. And working with the tribal community where you have limited resources, you have transportation issues, you maybe have 2 or 3 generations living in one household or multiple families of the same generation living in the household. Those types of stressors, along with handling the needs of a disabled child, oftentimes triggers events to occur. And then also educational issues as an indicator, such as low grades, dropout. Children have had to be retained in the grade at a grade level. And also exposure to drugs and alcohol. If there's drugs and alcohol occurring in the home, those could be contributed to an individual indicator as well. And also truancy and chronic absenteeism. Interestingly enough, in regards to truancy and drugs and alcohol in the whole educational arena, from what I've seen here in New Mexico, and I just only had the opportunity to talk to other tribes outside of New Mexico, is that we're seeing a different trend on how we're responding to that in regards to tribal codes. Tribal codes that also include a juvenile law and order area oftentimes tend to have a higher degree of penalty for youth and their families, as opposed to someone who's being introduced into the court system, into social services under the Child Welfare Code. And the reason is that some tribal governments or programs think that we need more teeth in getting parents and to comply and to provide additional support to their children, and children need to be more compliant. So we've had a great deal of discussion regarding this indicator or these indicators and how we're approaching this from a tribal law and order perspective. So I don't know what everybody else is seeing or how they're dealing with it, even at the state level. Continuing on, individual indicators. Parents and guardians with emotional, physical disabilities are also an individual indicator. Decades ago, there was an author by the name of Norman Polanski, and he authored a book called Damaged Parents. And that was a part of my my social work training. And it was interesting because whenever we talk about damaged parents, that's a pretty hard title or some hard labels to to apply to parents. But when you look at the background of parents and their emotional and physical difficulties and their own history, you kind of understand a little bit more about how that perpetuates some of the events that occur for children in child abuse or delinquency. So also another indicator here is parents who are incarcerated or parent who is incarcerated or even a caregiver. And I see this as an indicator, and I've seen it from more of the behavioral health, at the behavioral health level, is that if parents or a parent or caregiver continues to repeat a cycle that causes their incarceration, either once a year or once every 2 years or every 3 years, then that's a signal for me in dealing or working with the family as a whole that we need to have some open dialogue about the triggers that cause the incarceration and how incarceration is being interpreted and talked about with children. Because if it's just a matter-of-fact type of thing, if it's just an okay occurrence that it happens every few years or every few months even, then that sends a different message than what we would like to hear in relation to our criminal justice system. We'd like to see the numbers go down, but if they continue to go up and we start housing not only the adults but their children, and then we see that generational change, then obviously, we need to have more communication and more discussions about family and individual thoughts about incarceration. If individuals are victims of bullying or peer problems, those are also indicators for being at risk. Victims in these types of cases have limited or a few options on how they react to this. They can either go back and just internalize everything and they just keep it into themselves. They can share it with a trusted friend or a parent, or they can act out. And oftentimes when these types of situations occur where the bully or the victim is now becoming the bully, that's when you see the turnaround. And also with peer problems, I think children that I've seen and worked with from the ages of grades of third grade on up to 7th grade that are experiencing peer problems or feel like they're being bullied in some way, and the problem is not addressed either through counseling or communication between school and parents, this becomes a turnaround later on for 8th, 9th grade, where either the child sees the options for reaction of limited. Either they do things that are harmful to themselves, or they go to the extreme and they now become the bully themselves. So I think that this at-risk indicator is pretty important. And then also the discipline problems at school. I did some training back in October here in Albuquerque and talked a little bit about the importance of incorporating any type of child welfare services to include the education component, meaning that teachers in schools being involved in what we're doing from the child protective side, because they know on the day-to-day roles that they have at the school, whether students are coming to school regularly, the demeanor of the students, whether there's chronic absenteeism, whether they have even the paper and pencil to do their studies throughout the day, whether they have lunch money or they're eating and those types of things. So that's another layer of collaboration that I would highly emphasize to help us understand and identify those indicators as being relevant to the investigations that we conduct regularly. And patterns of, for the individual, continued here, patterns of unusual and excessive behaviors and moods. I just emphasize the educational level, and I think that, this pretty much speaks to it, is that in order for us to really understand time and occurrence of at-risk children and all of the events that are linked to them, we need to have that understanding about what's going on a day-to-day basis. And we know our teachers and our child care providers have a lot of that information. And then also recent dramatic changes in behavior and mood. Others that are in relation to individual indicators could also be health problems that stem or are perpetuated by neglect, such as head lice, impetigo, developmental delays, children exposed to methamphetamine, opiates, alcohol, and nicotine. I know most of you or all of you are aware that we have a higher number of children being born with disabilities, and some of those are they're hard to understand or to identify as whether these are just a natural occurrence or not. But I think as I've begun to talk with and work with families who have a child who's born with even spina bifida or other physical defects, you can pretty much see that there are some issues that these parents are having. And if you look at the SAMHSA study, I apologize that I don't have that on my PowerPoint, but SAMHSA did a study within the last 2 years where they had indicated that females or mothers, 15 to 17-year-old girls, or 16 to 22, had higher levels of alcohol and substance abuse during pregnancy and abusing prescription drugs, therefore contributing to some of what I think are the problems that we're seeing with either premature births or children that are born with a disability. So here, I just wanted to put this out, and you all have it. You should have it in your PowerPoint, or if you do have it. It is case scenario number 1. Krista is a 14-year-old who has run away from home several times in the last 3 months. She is in the custody of her grandmother. Krista's grandmother has never reported her missing, but sends her messages on Facebook asking where she is and if she is okay. The grandmother, who had similar issues with Krista's mother, who is now absent from the home. So, ideally, and this is similar to something that I've dealt with, is what are the other issues? What other issues would or could you explore in this situation? And that's the primary question that I have for myself. But if this individual has not been referred to the police as a runaway, what are other methods to provide intervention and explore the reasons why Krista is running away? And I took this case actually from one that I handled not very long ago. And when you look at the individual indicators and you look at who may be observing these indicators, it always triggered me back to our schools. Our running away from home is a part of a few criminal codes that are here in New Mexico. And because of the grandmother being the caretaker and this now being a generational issue, how do we as a community respond or understand the indicators so that we can provide appropriate intervention services? So just to let you know a little bit about what I did on this case is once it finally was reported by the school that the child had been gone for an excess of 5 days, and it was referred to law enforcement and social services and myself, it allowed me to go in and talk with the grandmother and ask some questions, which we'll talk about a little later, specific questions about how the grandmother felt about reporting, about her own history, about her own parent-child relationship and her relationship with her grandmother and so forth. And as one of the indicators mentioned earlier regarding the physical and emotional difficulties of parents and caregivers, this was one that fit right into that indicator. And it's also the parent being incarcerated. So, the way that, just quickly how we handled that was we developed a coordinated approach that involved our school system, and that also involved our elderly programs to see how we could all provide not only support services for the child, but also the grandmother. Seems to be working so far, but we'll see. So family indicators, domestic violence, family isolation, poor parent-child relationships, and so forth. When it comes to, the parent-child relationships, as a counselor, working and providing direct services to juveniles, particularly juvenile offenders that were referred to me after incarceration, I honestly can say that poor parent-child relationships do not always come from or are associated with teenagers. Poor parent-child relationships can and do occur from the age of birth all the way to adulthood. And what these parent-child relationships look like, or how I've gone to research them a little bit with individual families, is that it links a lot to generational influences, which you find on that last bullet point. If certain parents or parents had the same type of relationship or developed their parenting styles based on the model provided to them from their own upbringing, then, and if it was negative, then it perpetuates that poor parent-child relationship. And then with the parenting stress, some of the questions that I ask during my intake process with parents is about employment, about housing, about debt, about access to resources. So parenting stress and the family indicator are definitely areas worth exploring. Of course, I've had some feedback from colleagues saying that employment, money issues, and stuff like that are not relevant for high-risk cases, but rather providing full services to the children. But when you talk about the indicators and children being with their family or identifying with their family, it's important that we understand those parenting stressors. And then also divorce and separation, definitely hard on a child of any age. And then here we go to incarceration, family involved in the justice system, family structure. Family structure, I associate this with if you have families where you may have the biological mother, but she's got a boyfriend and he's got his kids, or, you know, it's a blended family type thing. Sometimes those family structures can be indicators if there is a negative stream of events that occur, or that one or both parents have a history of issues with law enforcement or other services, and that type of thing. And then housing issues. I think housing issues are probably one of the primary indicators that I see when working with families. If they're living in housing, or they're living with a family temporarily, they're transit between the reservation and the city or another tribal community, those are definitely an indicator to look forward or look for in your contact with families, either in an investigation or a support service process. So here, for the second case scenario, John's father has been incarcerated at the tribal jail for more than 3 months due to an assault charge. John's uncle has also been incarcerated for similar charges, including a DUI. John is the oldest of the 2 children. So when we're talking about family indicators and the incarceration piece, you know, why would this even be important to know or to understand? And you know, when we look at the indicators and we look at the levels of indicators, looking at family violence or exposure to violence or the potential for violence and the family pattern and the alcohol-related issues that a child is exposed to or children are exposed to, we know that digging a little deeper into the issues related to not only the father's incarceration but also the uncle's incarceration is important. And it's just as important to ask the child about what their thoughts are and their perspectives regarding situations that might be similar to this. So community indicators, community violence, and this is that last tier in that diagram I showed you earlier in the PowerPoint. So family violence, disadvantaged housing areas. For those of you that have ever done a community mapping process, you look at the area, if you're in a tribal community or a small rural community, or even your larger communities, I guess, you might be able to map out areas that you probably are working with clients from most often. And I think that this is important. If you have a higher number of clients that are coming from maybe a low-income housing area, or a housing area where if there are not good paved roads or poor lighting, or maybe some feral dogs or animals, that type of thing, those are definitely worth looking at, because if you're having a higher number of clients coming from those specific areas, then what do we need to do, or who do we need to collaborate with in order to increase intervention services or prevention and outreach services? Also, if there are limited outreach and awareness, lack of transportation, disengaged leadership and support. And I speak probably more from a tribal perspective on this, is that if we have tribal leadership or corporation leadership and they have a different priority, or they are not interested maybe on issues such as this, like increasing family wellness or connectedness, then that leads into becoming a much bigger problem. because if community feels, especially within our tribal communities, if we don't have the support, oftentimes we don't have that monetary support. We don't have that advocacy at the state level to give us more money to help us with our child welfare events or that type of thing. So that is an indicator that I believe is truly important from that level. And then also lack of resources and advocacy. And the other part, and I know that this probably would be questioned quite a bit, but program capacity, confidence, and priorities are other indicators. And what I mean by program capacity is being a community indicator. And some of these things cannot be helped, and I know that, because if you're in a rural area and you can't recruit qualified people to come and work, or you can't, your retention rate for employees is pretty low, then, you know, obviously these are not faults of any manager or director, but if you don't have the staffing level to meet the needs of your community, that does pose a problem, because then you have to either reduce your amount of time in providing direct services or outreach, or you have to maybe refer clients to other services. You look at clients probably more from a superficial level, meaning like, well, okay, I think we can just provide this amount of services, but let's see if we can refer them to this other agency. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that come with program capacity if you don't have it. Also, staff competence. With the staff competence, I think if you have the heart for it and you want to work, but you don't have the training, and you don't have the background for either child protective services or, you know, doing any type of prevention work, sometimes that can be a problem. Like I mentioned so many times before, this is only through my experience in being a manager as well, is that whenever staff does not have the appropriate training or background, oftentimes this can lead to problems. And it ends up being an indicator, because if people can't trust your program or they don't trust the quality of services that they're receiving, then they're not either going to report or they're not going to self-refer themselves to your services because of that issue. And then also priorities, and this relates to the tribal leadership or the leadership and community advocacy, is that if the priorities of the community or your tribal or your city leadership isn't aligned with what you're trying to do, then you don't have that level of maybe financial or capacity support to do what you need to do in responding to child abuse. So right here, just another case example to support the community indicators section is Emma is a new hire at the Tribal Social Services Program. The program has had high staff turnover in the last 4 years. Emma is a community member with 1 year of college education. Part of her new job duties are to conduct intake interviews with referred clients. She begins to do her intake interview with Janelle, who is being referred for alleged child neglect in parenting classes. Emma asks all of the standard questions on page 1 of her form, but then asks Janelle to sit and complete the form on her own. So what's wrong with this situation? And I tell you, I'm lessons learned here that, you know, I've made this mistake a few times in my career, and it's half the time come back to bite me. But failing to ask all of the questions of the client sends a message that the client's situation is not that important and that it does not give an opportunity to find out whether Janelle is able to understand the questions, therefore providing unclear responses. Training for Emma would be necessary in order to emphasize the importance of completing the intake process and the importance of the first impression of the agency and understanding through observation the importance of observation and conversation. Indicators that could have been identified could have been about the educational level, domestic violence or other domestic issues, or a learning disability. If I'm dealing with young parents or even grandparents that are raising grandchildren, sometimes it is so critical that you follow through whatever intake process that you have. And if your staff isn't trained to fully understand this, or you don't have that acknowledgement through even your policies and procedures, then that can be a problem. And those are things that they may seem minimal, but they can be big problems. And they could be actual reasons why some families go through that continuum, that cycle of events, more than one time in a 10-year period. It's because maybe they don't understand, or they don't feel as if they're being, that their situation is that important that they need to pay attention to the initial process that brings them to your organization or to any organization. So the health impacts of childhood abuse, mental health disorders and addictions, sexual and reproductive health issues, and other quality of life issues. Risks for intimate partner violence, alcoholism, and alcohol abuse and illicit drug abuse are definitely impacts of child abuse. Smoking and drinking at an early age, depression and suicide attempts are things that are a result of child abuse. Multiple sexual partners, sexually transmitted diseases, unintended pregnancies, and early initiation of sexual activity, as well as adolescent pregnancy and fetal death. So all of these incidents that occur are definitely impacts of childhood abuse. And when I'm talking probably more about our parents and our caregivers, that, you know, if these are cycles or the beginning of a cycle that they're a part of, then we can almost, I don't want to say predict, but we could almost not be surprised when an incident of child abuse occurs. Therefore, it is important to get the full history of families, whether you're law enforcement, behavioral health, social services, or even during your forensic interviewing process and your intake process. So because we're focusing on Native American children, just a refresher, common service providers for this particular group are the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Services, and other community-based programs. And I just, whenever I went over indicators, I went over levels, and I provided some examples and so forth, but the overall response to the indicators and just working with these particular agencies that I've identified, you find that they have certain policies or protocols that they follow. And these policies and protocols don't always reflect, or they hardly ever reflect, the community, aside from some community-based programs, meaning that there's limited ability for these agencies in their work or response to issues related to children and families. They can't divert from those policies, which makes it very hard because each community is different. Each community resource is different. Each community's history is different. And I think when they just have like a one-size-fits-all type of approach, oftentimes you're not giving the community an opportunity to fully understand and heal from whatever has happened, whatever traumatic event has happened. So although these are the common service providers that we see within tribal communities, and they are there, oftentimes it's difficult because we can't force the community culture and tradition into that one arena. So service provider limitations, and I've listed them out here. Program services are not always based on tribal culture, capacity, or resources. Staff may not be well-trained or culturally competent in working with tribal victims and their families. So the community-based programs can and should be community-specific, but sometimes developing their own standard operating procedures or policies based on other agencies are not always helpful because they're not based specifically on the community. And one of the requests that I always hear from clients, other tribes is, well, can you send me a policy that way, and we can just change the name and and see what we can do about using that or getting that passed through council or that type of thing. And I'm more than happy to share whatever I've developed with permission of my clients. But the problem that I see in that is that whenever you're taking another organization's document and trying to adopt that as your own, it doesn't always reflect the uniqueness of each tribe. And coming from an educational background, specific with Native Americans, we all know that if there's 566 tribes, then that's 566 epistemologies or ways of knowing, ways of doing things. Culture and tradition is different. So, I think it's very important in order for us to be more reactive or more responsive to the needs of at-risk children or families, we really need to look at our internal organizational process first and how we're delivering services and how we can enhance our systems to be more reactive to what the community is as far as their dynamics and beliefs and values and so forth. So okay, so we're going to talk now, and I have this diagram here because I just wanted to emphasize that we have all of these indicators in one arrow going the other way, but we have our systems running or functioning and going off in the other direction. And oftentimes that's probably something that we don't want to do. So how can you use indicators to enhance child abuse protocols? So for individual indicators, as we went over those, I'm just going to provide some examples of how we could use those individual indicators. And I'm sure all of you have some type of reporting form. If you need more information or would like examples of the indicator forms that I have, please you can contact Melissa Hansen, and she'll help you with that. But examples of the individual indicators in your line of questioning or intake or fact-finding on cases is that asking if the child has a disability, developmental delays, is on prescription medications, asking the age at what age they were diagnosed with anything, if they do disclose that there is a disability or health problem, getting the prenatal history, length of the residence that they are at, the family is at this time, and getting a history of where they've been before, or getting a 5-year history. And why this is, I believe that these are important, and why I've incorporated this into my own intake system as part of my indicators assessment, is that I need to know, especially, for example, with our prenatal history questions, what type of pregnancy did you have? You know, did you get prenatal care? When did you find out you were pregnant? What kind of birth did you have? How many children? What is the birth order of this particular child? Asking those types of questions are really important to understand, especially in child neglect cases where you might have 3 children and the child that's being neglected may be the middle child. The birth order is important to know and understand, so that you know how you can relate to the family as far as needs and concerns. Asking the length of residence, even for the child. Asking, you know, how long have you lived here? If they're old enough, especially in the initial stages of the forensic interview process. Sometimes this question is overlooked, and it could be one of the most key factors in understanding how the child is able to communicate, where they live, where they define home, because oftentimes that home will either not be exactly the way that the parent or guardian has stated, or the reporting person, or even law enforcement. So asking this question, not only of the child but also the family too, is important. How long have you lived there? Who's, you know, and then you go on into that other part of the forensic interview, is who's in the home, and that type of thing. It's most important. And then also, you know, depending on the child's age, the reason for educational issues and truancy, if that were to be part of the referring problem. Family indicator questions or examples could be conversation. Beginning this part with the family is always going to be a conversational piece. It's never going to be direct questions, or it hasn't been with me as a home assessor or a guardian ad litem. But I need to understand, using my family indicators, the history or the understanding of violence and how they describe violence to me. I ask families, you know, can you tell me a little bit about how you understand violence in the community, or what would you deem a volatile issue, or a volatile, you know, an issue involving violence? Oftentimes, whenever parents or caregivers have referred to me, well, it's whenever you hit somebody. If that's what they determine as violence, then I know on my part I need to do more work in helping them understand that violence isn't just the physical action of someone doing something to another, but it also involves other elements that they need to understand, so that maybe I'm more effective at increasing their understanding of their situation. Also, asking indicators, asking about or including safety questions, marital relationships. You know, how many relationships, or have you been married before? You know, are you in a relationship now? That type of thing. Like I said, some of these questions all of you probably ask, or your partners ask, but it's worth asking again. I think sometimes repetition is good, because it also allows you to compare in your CPTs or your NBTs whether you're getting the same information from the family, as opposed to them not giving you the whole story. The other question in regards to family that I add that I think is a helpful addition to my work is asking about transportation, driving restrictions, or any type of restrictions. If there's someone in the home that is a registered sex offender and they're not supposed to be in the home, those are things that often can be revealed through the interview using indicators. And then the final piece, to understand the generational issues, is when working with small, at least the tribal communities that I work with, is I have the families develop a family tree. I give them some time to do it, but that helps me go back and work with another community member who's from that tribe to understand whether this family has a history within the social services arena or law enforcement or so forth. That history is very critical because from a behavioral health perspective or a social work, if you're a licensed independent social worker, then you know that there are probably some approaches in your treatment plan that you need to take into consideration that will help reveal and provide an opportunity for discussion regarding historical issues and breaking that chain of violence or neglect. Community indicator questions, examples are access to resources, and these are questions that I ask of clients. You know, how do you believe that you have access to resources? Can you get to a community resource that you need when you need it? What resources do you access most often in the community, and what for? And what resources do you stay away from or have strong feelings about? And when I ask this question, of course, parents are going to say, well, I don't trust social services. I don't trust the domestic violence program. And those are common responses, but my point is not to say, another one that doesn't trust social services or whatever. What it does is it gives me the opportunity to inform them from an objective perspective about the purpose of that program, the resources that are there, and navigate them in that direction so that they hopefully change their perspective on that agency. And just wanted to provide those. Like I said, if you want more information on those, you can contact Melissa Hansen. So some of the excuses that I hear for not using indicators are law enforcement is just working with the facts. You know, we're looking at it black and white. We have our codes. This is what we need to do. Social services, basically not enough trained staff. There's not enough time. And how important are some of these indicators, and how do they really relate to what we're doing? Mental health providers' responses have been, well, it's not relevant to the treatment plan. That's way too much information than with what we need to know. And, of course, the doctors or forensic examiners, they treat what they can see. They don't have enough staff and training on child abuse, so we don't want to delve any deeper into something that we just don't have the capacity to deal with. So those are, you know, definitely some of the common discussions or reasons that I hear from providers about why they just don't want to use the indicators, or they just don't have the time. So you have your cultural competence and awareness tip sheet, but the questions that I have for consideration is, how much do we know about the community? One of my biggest stresses with organizations, because I also do program evaluations, is asking community programs, how much do you really know? Just because you're from the community doesn't mean that you're fully the expert in the community. because even within our tribal communities, we're diverse. We have multiple faith-based organizations. We have traditional folks. We have our non-traditional folks. We have, language levels that are all different. I mean, there's so many different things that it would be impossible to be proficient in every aspect of the community. So that's the key question that I have to help me determine the competence and awareness. How much do we think culture plays a part in our jobs? And I think it plays a huge part, not because we incorporate every cultural aspect of the community into the work that we do, but culture influences how we develop policy, it develops how we communicate with clients or with each other or with tribal leadership. It just helps us determine treatment plans or outcomes for families, and how much does culture relate to social problems and solutions. I put the question out there, and it can be a tough question to answer because, what is culture? And when oftentimes people associate culture or use the word culture interchangeably with tradition, but that's not tradition. I don't see a clear association between culture and social problems, but I do see it as part of the solution. Because not everybody in the community, even in my own tribal community, do we have everybody that is involved in cultural activities. They might have been raised Presbyterian or Mormon, so they don't practice that faith or the belief system there. So, it's a really touchy question, but I encourage everyone to always explore what resources and assets there are in the community and how they can be incorporated into organization. Because I think that in order, when you talk of the bigger picture of child abuse, we can understand and define what child abuse is, but everything that is the outcome of a child abuse incident is really going to depend on how our organizations how we're organized, what our approach is, whether we're able to effectively relate to the clients that are coming in and also to our counterparts within the community, such as law enforcement, social services, behavioral health, and so forth. So on your tip sheet, you have some pieces of just some areas to consider in order for you to hopefully be more culturally competent. I know that there is the new, well, it's not so much new, it's been around for several years now, but cultural humility. That is like the highest level. We're not talking about cultural competence anymore being the highest level to achieve, but cultural humility. And I agree with a lot of the elements of that definition or that cultural being as a practitioner. But I think even if we're at a culturally competent level, then we're doing pretty good. So take a look at the tip sheet, and hopefully that will give you some ideas. Of what's needed. Systemic renewal, continuous critical inquiry into current practices. I want to emphasize that whatever we do specifically within Indian country or within tribal Alaska Native communities, it's almost eclectic. I mean, there's no other way to say it, but that we can't take one practice or something that we learned in the School of Social Work and say that this is going to apply to our work in a tribal community. Because even with my level of education as a doctor, it kind of goes out the window sometimes whenever you're going into a new tribal community. You have to relearn everything, and everything is based on the way that the community is structured. And your approach is always going to be changing based on that community. However, I think everything always falls back into ethics, professionalism, and that type of thing. So I think continuous critical inquiry is important. Identifying improvements, ways that we can make things better, removing organizational barriers. That goes along with the territorialism and information sharing, and providing a structure that supports change. So I think we're more effective in understanding indicators and applying them whenever we have our own internal renewal process. So that's just a diagram. Community system collaboration is really what it takes for us to be more effective in understanding the other indicators that probably exist within our own communities, but also sharing them with the community so that they're aware. I hate to think that oftentimes it's really, it's unfortunate that as the professionals in the community, we hold a certain knowledge, but we don't think of sharing that with the community at a level that they understand so that they can be their own advocates. All right, so we're on my last slide, and I just wanted to provide this visual diagram of what it is that the different resources that exist and how they link to each other. So that red dot there in the middle is child/family. And if we think about our tribal communities, as a tribal community, we may not have all of these resources, but we may have some of them. But we all interact with each other, and when we talk about systemic change, and cultural competency and understanding the indicators, these are all really what I see as the sources of that information. And, hopefully in looking at this diagram, you can see the importance of increased collaboration and sharing of information to further understand what indicators might be in your own community. So thank you very much. Again, my name is Melissa Riley, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you. So we have time for a few questions. And so one of our first questions is, from your perspective, Melissa, how much does a lack of culture or disconnection from culture relate to social problems?
How much, I'm sorry, repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, based on your perspective, how much does a lack of culture or a disconnection from culture relate to social problems?
As I mentioned when we were talking about this, is that, culture, the way that it's defined isn't always based on what we think as medicine people, ceremonies, tribal identity, and that sort of thing. I think that the social problem, the relation to social problems within the community have to do with their own identity and upbringing. Like, not everybody was raised traditional. Not everybody knows about, the traditional, what we deem as the traditional way of life. For example, and I'm using myself as an example here, I'm a Chiricahua Apache from Escalero, New Mexico, but my parents were Catholic, so we were born into that faith-based, or I was introduced into that faith-based system, and it wasn't until later that I was introduced into our traditional ways and understood a little bit more about the culture. And I think in working with some of my clients, I think first and foremost they need that understanding their identity and the identity of the community as far as diversity is a starting point. But I don't think that delving into culture and using that as a premise for delivering services or addressing social problems is always the issue, because most of the time especially with our younger generation who's become more migrating away or being exposed to Western or contemporary ways of life, like through Facebook and so forth, it's really hard to use that culture-based approach for a way of addressing social problems. But I think that there are lots of benefits to it. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, I think your further explanation and insight answered that question. So our next question is regarding one of the first slides where you discussed the 14 states that have a Native American, Alaska Native population beyond 100,000. Where could our listeners view that list of those specific states? Do you have any recommendations?
Melissa, can I go back? I think I have that in the slide. You can go in the slide in the resource page, the U.S. Census Bureau.
Perfect.
It's in there, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then you also made mention of a study in regards to individual indicators. Could you just repeat the name of that study again for our listeners?
The study and the individual indicators. Oh, with Norman Polanski and the damaged parents?
Yes, yeah. I just wanted to make sure that they got the title.
Yeah, so the author, it's a book, and the author is Norman Polanski, Polanski, and the title of the book is called Damaged Parents: An Anatomy of Child Neglect.
Okay, thank you. So that's all the time that we have today for questions. So if we did not get a chance to answer your question during the webinar, please stay tuned for future webinars with Melissa, where we will further discuss interview strategies with Native American children and their families, and additional outreach, prevention, and intervention strategies on child safety. These future webinar announcements will be made in the coming weeks, and they'll also be made available on our website, which is in your handout, and will be made available on the upcoming slide right here. Thank you. So before we close, I'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar and give a special thanks to Melissa Riley for joining us.
Thank you, Melissa.
And lastly, Christina, did you have any closing remarks?
Yes, I did. So please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. As Melissa mentioned, this webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. For more information, contact OJJDP NTTAC or Fox Valley Technical College. And here is the feedback survey link. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.